Okay, so GMT, or UT, whichever way I call it, we have 20 hours, we have 42 minutes, right?
Yep.
And 53 seconds. Okay. Yeah, so we have an HS, 65 degrees, 50.0 minutes. Okay, so going first with that, if we have 35 feet of height of I, what is our dip correction? Right. Okay, and that gives us 65 degrees, 44.3 minutes. And then we have a main correction of what?
15.5.
Okay, 15.5 minutes, which gives us an HO of 65 degrees, 59.8 minutes. Almost 66 degrees. Alrighty. So with all of that then, we then go and we find the position of the sun, right? So
That's the
the
altitude correction.
GHA
On that first.
for the day and the hour for the sun is what?
35 feet? No.
In the almanac.
5.7 was the dip. At 15.5 is this altitude correction.
Okay.
65.
16.0 minutes, I mean.
15.5 is plus
Yeah, okay, so, right. And then our declination is what? Is it? It's no, anyone give me some numbers?
11 degrees, 44.3 minutes.
11 degrees, 44.3 minutes. Our little d number is negative because the sun's going down, and what is that?
0.8.
Okay. Okay, so when we go now to for the minutes and seconds to GHA, back in the gray pages, what do we get for that? Someone different. Anybody
10 degrees, 43.3.
Okay. All right. So we have 129 degrees,
59.3. Almost 60 again.
59.3 minutes for GHA. And then if we have a rate of declination decreasing at 0.8 of a minute per hour, how much did it decrease in the
0.6.
yeah, 42 minutes? So it's 0.6 minus. So that gives us north 11 degrees. 43.7. Right? Okay, so we're going to pick an assumed latitude, as usual, 33 degrees north. But our assumed longitude is 117 degrees. Now this is a spot where, in fact, if our chart had gone further to the east, we might have picked, 116 degrees, 59.3. But we don't have that on the coastal chart most of you are using. So I went ahead and picked 117 instead, 59.3. Okay, so that gives an LHA of what?
12.
12 degrees. Okay, so now we have what we need to go into the 249 tables. Okay, and so we go in, and the first thing we're looking for is an HC. And we cross-index 11 degrees of declination with 12 degrees of LHA. And what does that give us? Yes, at least that's what I got. 24 minutes. We have a little D number of what? 54. And if we look and we see each time we jump another whole degree of declination, it's getting positive by that amount. So this is positive 54. And then finally we get a Z number of what?
151.
Okay, 151 degrees. Okay, so if now we go, this is our second adventure with a little D number, and if we cross-index 54 with this, let's round this from 43.7 to 44. 54 with 44, what do we get for a correction here? Okay.
I had 39,
Okay. I got 40, but I might have actually used 43 instead of 44, but I'm going to say it's 40. That's what I got, so you got something different. It's only going to be a little bit off. So the HC then is 65 degrees, 64 minutes, right? Okay, which is the same as the 66. It is, but since we've got to do a subtraction, I'm going to leave it as it is. So our Z of 151, if you know from the little formula at the top of the page, Zn is, if the LHA is less than 180, Zn equals 360 minus Z. So we have 360 degrees, and we make that subtraction, and that gives us an intercept of,
209.
oh sorry, it gives us a Zn, sorry, of 209. Yeah, I think that's what I got. Let's see, yep, that's what I got. So 209 degrees equals the Zn. Okay? Now, the HC is 6564. The HO is 6559. So, the HO is smaller, 6559.8. And if we subtract 59.8 from 64, what do we get? It's 4.2, right? 4.2, that's the intercept. And because the HO is smaller, we're actually away from the sun by that. Away. Okay? So if then we were to plot that out on our chart, I'm just going to sort of okay. So on our chart, imagine this is your plotting sheet, and up here you've got 33 degrees north, and our assumed longitude was the longitude we subtracted from the LHA, and that was 117.59.3. So let's say that's 117 degrees, 59.3 minutes. Our Zn was 209. So 209 is out here somewhere, but we're going to go 4.2 miles away. 4.2 miles away, and so we're up here is our line of position. And the perpendicular to that line, that perpendicular is our LOP that we're somewhere on. Okay, does that make sense? This doesn't have all the stuff like the coastline and everything else, but it is a little bit more resembling the plotting sheets we started the class with. Since you won't be normally doing this on coastal charts, you'll be doing it in the ocean on plotting sheets. Okay, so all that makes sense now?
I one question though, just because I was a little confused on this at first, but I think I just realized it doesn't matter. Because when I was looking at the AP for the the longitude, I was thinking it'd be 116,
right.
59.3 because it's closer. I realize though now that it doesn't really matter. It just basically might make a difference about whether you're away or towards.
Right, right. And I mentioned that once before, but let me do that again. If this had been a plotting sheet, or if it had been a chart that was further to
You would
the
have
east,
the closer one.
we would have picked the closer one. It's just that
But it doesn't matter though because it
doesn't matter.
It just made it from the other direction.
That's right. It shouldn't be more than a degree away. As long as it's not more than a degree away, it doesn't matter which one you use. If we use the one we did here, it makes for a much longer line, right, to get us down to the longitude we're actually at. If we'd have picked the longitude here, it probably would have been 33. It would have been towards the sun, and we would have had this line coming in here like this. Okay? I was at Bird Rock in OB, which is a good place to do this. There's a little park there, and you get a good shot of the horizon, and a little bit to the southeast. So if it's before noon, you can actually get a decent shot from there too.
Not Bird Rock Isthmus.
What's that?
You can see on Bird Rock on the Isthmus.
Oh yeah, no, not different bird rock. There's lots of bird rocks because there's lots of birds and there's lots of rocks. So a lot of them have
Even the one in La Jolla, 595599 Calumet.
Yeah.
The address.
Is that a good one too?
You can get us out.
Yeah, I think any of those things that project out a little bit, that gives you a little bit of a. So other good locations include, Clear National Monument, and probably on the bay side, Coronado at Coronado Beach. That's a good one because it arcs out a bit, and so that gets you a little bit away. So So lots of good spots to shoot from. Okay. So that is the time site that we have been practicing and doing over and over again, and all you guys seem like you're just real comfortable with it, so that's great. Okay, last time we talked about the noon sight, and once again, the noon sight is what happens when the sun passes your meridian, right? So that's important to know ahead of time to plan for, because you want to be up there with your sextant in hand, pointed at the horizon when the sun passes your meridian. But actually you want to be there a little bit before that. What you want to do is start plotting it before it passes your meridian and catch it on the way up, and then you get a bunch of relatively same numbers, and then catch it on the way down, so you know you've passed noon. So a lot of the game is actually in plotting it effectively. So that being the case, I've also got what I just do with my piece of paper here. Okay. So what I'd like everybody to do now is I'd like you to look to August 18th and figure out by our local time when noon occurs. Okay? So go to August 18th, meridian passage, and remember that we're at 117 degrees, 117 and a quarter degrees, 117.25 degrees. And the sun is moving at what speed? Well, yeah. Well, how many? Let's relate that in terms of arc. Okay. How many degrees per minute? It's 4 degrees per minute, right? Time zones are about 15 degrees apart, so that's an hour. 15 degrees, 4 minutes. It's kind of like that. So that's you use that several times for predictive things. We're going to talk about another instance of that later.
Can you say our longitude again?
It's at 117 degrees and 15 minutes.
15 is it?
Or you can use 117.25 degrees also. So take just a couple minutes here and do that. Do any of you have any questions about how to do that, how to make that prediction? And all I did was I looked at my watch, and I said, okay, it's 10 seconds or 15 seconds. I got the sun lined up, and when it was perfectly lined up, I wrote it down. And so I started at 12:40, and I began at 69 degrees 36 minutes, and I was up there until 1 o'clock. So I did 20 different observations. And indeed, these numbers get bigger, and they go gradually. And it's not perfect because, this whole thing isn't perfect. They go up and down a bit, so it's 69 degrees, 40 minutes, 41.2, 41.2, 44, 45, 45.5, 46.5, 47.4, 48.8, 48.8, 49.0, 49.3, 49.7, 49.7, 49.7, 49.0. Now that occurs a little bit after what we predicted it would, but if you note, we've got 3 numbers that are about the same, where it didn't seem to move, and then it started down. And then I missed one, and then it was 47.5, 46.1.
So
Okay.
are you just watching the time, and then
I'm just-
every minute you just write down your
Right, I'm
chance?
getting them about a minute apart,
Okay.
and I'm looking at my watch. And because these stay the same or move very slowly over that, like the number we're actually going to use, 49.7, was the same over 3 minutes, a period of 3 minutes. So the actual second didn't matter in there, okay, because it goes there and it just hangs there for a while, okay? So see, there's several ways that you can have a second person say, ready, 10 seconds, 5 seconds, mark, and then you read it. Or you can just make a recording of yourself saying, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, and, do it that way if you want. And then just be noting yourself or have a timer or something like that. But really just looking at your watch and, getting these things about a minute apart is usually adequate. What we're after, though, is this number right here, which is, in effect, our HO, right? HS, excuse me. So that HS took place at noon, which was local mean time, 12 hours and 54 minutes, which would have been 19 hours, 54 minutes Greenwich Mean Time, right? Okay, with that in mind, let me move around these things again. Okay, so again, we have August 18th. Our time And Greenwich Mean Time was 19 hours. GMT, 19 hours, 54 minutes. HS was 69 degrees, 47.4 minutes. Is that what I said?
49.7.
Oh, 49 points. Yes, 40. I'm sorry, 49.7. Height of I was 5 feet. Okay, so let's start off with correcting the section like we usually do. So a height of 5 feet gives us a dip number of what? Minus what?
About 2.2.
Okay. It's 2.2. I think I used 2.3 actually.
Between the two.
Yeah, so I use that, but since I've got this written down, let's just go with that. Okay, so we have 69 degrees, 47.4. Okay, and we have a main correction of, anybody tell me what we have for that? That's what I got. 15.6, which gives us 69 degrees and 63 minutes, which actually you can't have, so that's 70 degrees, 03 minutes for an HO. Now, we are going to need to find the declination, but we don't need to bother ourselves much with GHA in this case. So for declination, for the day and for the day and the hour, we have a declination of north something. You can tell me from the almanac what that might be? 12 degrees.
44.7.
Okay, 44.7 minutes. Yes. Okay, as we have a D, little d of minus 0.8, which when we did this timing-wise was 54 minutes. What does that give us for an actual correction number? That minus 0.8 turns into what?
Minus 0.7.
Yes. Okay, so we end up with a declination of north 12 degrees, 44.0 minutes. Okay, so now we have an HO, and we've got a declination. And we have a formula. And so you guys all wrote down formulas last time. And so our formula for this situation, we are in the northern hemisphere, the sun is in the northern hemisphere, but we have a higher latitude than the sun's declination, right? We are north of the sun. So in that instance of the three that we're talking about, the latitude equals 90 degrees minus HO plus the declination. 90 degrees minus the HO plus. So what I do here typically is I take that 90 degrees and I make that 89 degrees 60 minutes, so we don't have a carrying over mistake. That's the number we get here. We subtract that from our HO, 70 degrees, 03 minutes, and we end up with 57 minutes, 19 degrees, 57 minutes. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, plus the declination, which is 12 degrees, 44.0 minutes. And so that ends up with, when we add those, that ends up being 31 degrees, 101 minutes, I believe. 31 degrees, 101 minutes. But of course, there is no such thing as 101 minutes, so that's really 32 degrees. You subtract 60 from that, that's 41 minutes, equals our latitude. Did I get that right? Okay. So
You only do this at local noon, or at or near local noon.
right. It's that. So mathematically or arithmetically, it's a lot simpler to do this than it is the time sites that you've been doing. But there is this issue of having to predict when noon happens, and you've also got to get up there and catch it. You know, if it happens to be cloudy about then, you're kind of stuck. So the amount of time you can get your observation during the day is right during those 2 or 3 minutes where the sun's hanging there. And if there's no sun, you're kind of out of luck. Or if there's no horizon, you're out of luck. Whereas a time sight, you can take it any time the sun's out, including at noon. All right? So but does the concept at all make sense? It's pretty straightforward. The spherical triangle has collapsed, and meridian passage is where you're at. And but because the sun hangs there for it's not the same star we look at, okay? Because it's been long enough that it has moved. So that is a bit of a problem in that it's moving around up there. And it's a bit of a problem that isn't exactly north anyway, and that the north, not only do all the stars rotate around the north celestial pole, even the North Star does rotation around the north celestial pole. So that ends up being a bit of a trial. Nonetheless, it's close enough that it's a really handy thing to have. And, hang on a second. Go back to this. Okay. Back a few hundred years ago, people were coming up with this gadget right there. So this is our show and tell for today. This is something called a nocturnal. This particular nocturnal is a replica of one that was invented in the late 1500s by a clockmaker in London named Humphrey Cole. And the way it works is, if you look at the star chart we just passed out, you first of all find the North Star, okay, Polaris, which is at the top of the page, okay, and you can find the North Star by looking at a real conspicuous constellation called the Big Dipper. We all learned about that on campouts, right? It looks like a Big Dipper. And the two outermost stars at the edge of the Dipper are called the pointers. And those point directly to the North Star, to Polaris. You see how that is on your star chart? Okay, well, this little device, the nocturnal, is what you do is you set it up for the day, you know, the month and the day, and you hold it up, you hold this up, so this is down, and this is lined up, depending on how you want to do it, either with the stars called the guards, which are Kochab and the star next to it, or you line it up with the pointers of the Big Dipper. There's two scales on here, one for each one. And what will that tell you? Well, it's kind of a cool device. I'm going to pass it around. What it will tell you is, it'll tell you the time of the night. By what you do is, when I say you line it up, there's a hole in the middle. And you look through the hole at the North Star, and you move this around to line it up with the pointers. And that what that will tell you, it'll tell you the time of the night, if you want, because people didn't have clocks in those days so much. It will tell you also, if you look on the back, it'll tell you the phase of the moon and the tide, based on there being 2 tides a day, when the tide's going to happen. Okay, but it also will give you a number on the back side, a degree number. And the degree number is what you enter into this table that was used in most early modern navigational treatises called the Rule of the North Star. And by entering in that table with that number, you can find out the correction to apply to your astrolabe or your cross staff to tell you what your latitude is. Okay, it was a pretty cool device. So this combined with a table, take the measurement with this to get the altitude with a cross staff. Can't use a back staff because it doesn't cast shadow, or astrolabe or a quadrant, and you got your latitude. So I'm going to pass this around. Guys, you can, we'd go back and demonstrate it, but you know, there's no star out there because it's daylight. But it's a pretty cool little gizmo. It's actually kind of an early analog computer. I'm sorry? Yeah, they were over there last time I saw.
What do you point the big one at again?
Either one, you have a choice, either at the guards or the pointers. The guards, Kochab is one of the guards. The pointers are so this is Kochab here, and these are the pointers in the North Star. So just so you know, there's a bunch of stars associated with the Big Dipper that it's easy to find things. If you follow the arc of the Big Dipper around the sky, just look at the Big Dipper and follow it around, you'll see, following that arc, you'll see Arcturus. Well, first you'll see Alcade, which is a useful navigational star, and then you see Arcturus, and you continue the arc around to the same distance, and you see Spica. So Polaris, Alcade, Arcturus, and Spica are all stars that you can use for doing navigation. Okay? There are some other ones that are fairly straightforward. Most people know how to find Orion. If you look at your chart, it's the Hunter. And there's 3 stars in the middle that make his belt, and those are pointer stars also. They point towards Sirius, which is the brightest star in the sky. It's actually 2 stars. They're binary. It's rotating around, so Sirius changes its magnitude from time to time. And the exact opposite direction is Aldebaran. So now you've got Sirius and Aldebaran, which you can easily find. And the corners of Orion are all really good, useful stars too. There's Bellatrix, Betelgeuse, and Rigel. Okay? All which are easy to find and make useful stars. Now it turns out that when you can see Orion, you can't see Scorpio, which is another really conspicuous constellation. Looks like a scorpion. So if you go to the right, all the way to the right, you'll see Scorpius or Scorpio, and it looks like a scorpion. It's pretty obvious. Right where the scorpion's red eye is Antares. So that's useful because you can't see Orion, you can see that. Okay? And in all honesty, you almost don't need anything else. Okay? Those are all easy stars to find. The trick is, though, you can see these at night, like when you're on a camp out, but does that help you any if you're using a sextant? Can't see the horizon, right? Your problem here in doing this is that you've got to actually see both the horizon and the stars. So, a couple things. When all the stars aren't there, and only the brighter ones are, in some respects it's easier because you only see the bright ones, so it's not as complicated of a picture and confusing. On the other hand, it's hard to see because there's light out, and the sunlight, the remains of it, are competing with the stars.
Moonlight's the best you got.
Okay, so we'll talk about the moon later, but moonlight isn't really very helpful in shooting stars. The reason is because with
For the horizon.
for the horizon, it's not going to help you much because the horizon illuminated by moonlight tends not to be accurate. So you pretty much got to pick twilight. The only time you can really do that is if you're shooting the moon and or stars or planets, and you're shooting these things after twilight. If you're careful about picking 3 things that are each about 120 degrees apart on the horizon, the errors cancel out, kind of. And you can kind of do that through the course of the night. But this is a pretty good chart. This is from the back of the Celestaire catalog. And I find this thing a pretty easy way to find my way around. But like I said, the stars that I just mentioned are really almost the only ones I've ever needed to use. Okay, but back to that. We're just on the North Star today. And so how do you do that? Well, if you look at your almanac, like if we look at the almanac for today, today's August 31st, right?
20th.
Sorry, 20th. I'm getting ahead of myself, aren't I? So August 20th, it's the 21st. It's the 21st. If you see the sun page we've been using, there's the moon page. Let's just ignore the moon page for a minute. To the right, you'll see some tables for twilight and moonrise, okay? And what it will give you is, when you're looking down these tables, it will give you the times that you can be out there shooting. So for sunrise, nautical twilight comes first, and then civil twilight. And in the evening, civil twilight comes first, and then nautical twilight, okay?
Nautical twilight's when the sun touches the horizon?
No, it's actually a bit below the horizon in both cases. You can't see the sun at all in either twilight, okay? It's just sometime after that. If you notice, like it says, the evening twilight at the latitude we're at, which is, say, north 30, the sunset is at 1836, but twilight doesn't even start, civil twilight, until 1900. Okay, so look at it this way: civilians get to work later and get to go home earlier than sailors do. Okay, so civil comes later in the morning and earlier in the evening. But you go to the latitude closest to where you're at, and it will tell you when that is. Now, what you've got to do is still do the conversions. This is where it's at Greenwich, all right? And then you've got to do the same thing we did for the noon sight. Add the longitude from Greenwich, and then back out the the time zone we're at to find out the local time when twilight occurs. And that would allow you to be able to see Polaris. So let's just do a prediction then, okay? Take a few minutes and let's predict twilight, the time we can begin shooting today, okay? Basing this being at, well, we're probably closer to 35 degrees and 30, so we'll base it at 35 degrees, excuse me. So if you look at that on that table, that occurs Greenwich Mean Time at 1842, doesn't it? Everybody see that?
No. Where?
Go to August 21st.
Sunset.
Okay, you're looking at sunset at 35 degrees.
Sunset occurs at 1842.
1842, right?
Okay, then add the 7 hours.
No, not yet, because we don't really care about sunset other than, we might be looking for the green flash. What we care about is twilight. So twilight begins at 1908 and it ends in 1940, right? So there's 32 minutes of twilight today at 35 degrees north. So if we want to figure the beginning and end, then we do the 7 hours. And when we did the thing, what was it? 7 hours and 54 minutes from Greenwich. 469. Yeah, 469. But when we worked it out, it's about 7 hours 54. 17 hours 49 minutes. Okay, so add 7 hours and 49 minutes to say 1908, and then back out 7. So just add 49 minutes to it, right? Because you don't want to, why add 7 and take 7 out? So 1908, add 49 minutes and becomes 1957. So at 7:57, and then 1940, add 49 minutes becomes 884, so 24, so 8:24, right? So that's the time we've got to be up with our sextant looking at Polaris. Between civil twilight and nautical twilight, right? Those are the. After that, after nautical twilight, it's too dark to see the horizon. Before civil twilight, it's too light to see the stars. So that's our predictive value. So let's just say, for the heck of it, that, okay, if we take 1908 and we add 49 minutes to it, and that's 1957. So let's say at 20:04, we shot Polaris. 20 hours, 4 minutes, local mean time. We shot Polaris. And our HS, I'm making this up, so don't hold me to this. Our HS was 31 degrees, 38 minutes. Okay? 31 degrees, 38 minutes. All righty. So what we have to do is first of all, what we've always done is let's correct the sextant to get an HO. And let's say our height of eye is 5 feet. So take a couple of minutes and we'll do that. There is a difference though I want to point out, and that is when we went to the correct the sextant part, the table we've been using is sun, October to March and April, September, but the season doesn't matter. We simply go to the stars and planets column, and we use that for the main correction. Okay, so it's the middle column. So instead of sun, we use stars and planets. And also, there's no upper or lower limb for a star. It's an infinitely small dot. So we don't have to worry about what limb it was. We still have to correct for dip, and that's still the same. And it's just that our main correction is taken from that different table. I've forgotten already. Could someone tell me what I said it was?
31, 38.
31 degrees, 38 minutes. 5 feet. 5 feet, 31 degrees, 38 minutes. Margaret, did I hear there was a question?
Okay, let's see.
I'm sorry. 5 feet. Yeah.
Here we're only dealing with just refraction, nothing else.
Yeah. There's no semi-diameter because
Yeah.
it's a tiny. Yeah, it's a
And
tiny.
it doesn't matter if it's winter or summer, because the sun, that has to do with the side of the sun.
stars. Well, the thing is that the stars are infinitely far away.
Yeah, so there is
So
no
the Earth's
side.
position in
That's
the whole
only refraction.
doesn't-
We
that's
know
all
what
it is.
refraction is. That's we look at this table.
Right.
At any
That's it.
height
It's just dip
shot.
and that table. That's it. It's just height of eye and the main correction, which in this case is just refraction. So whereas it was positive for the main correction so far, for this, it's going to be negative numbers, isn't it?
Yep.
So both the dip and the refraction number, or main number, is negative. Okay, so let me get another piece of plastic out.
What was the assumed actual time we shot?
We said it was 8:04, didn't we? Did we say the time, local time was 8:04? Okay.
Like early morning?
Oh, sorry, 20:04.
Oh, okay.
I should have said, I should have clear on that. Oops. Okay. So I just made this up, so I worked it out, of course. So we had this as today, which is August 21st, Polaris. So a local mean time was 20 hours, 4 minutes, 04 minutes. We're at +7, so time zone +7, which is 27 hours, 04 minutes, but you can't have that, so that is 03 hours, 04 minutes, GMT, on
22nd.
August 22nd. Okay? So that's the time that we shot Polaris. And we said that the HS was, I believe I said it was 31 degrees, what was it?
38.
38 minutes. Okay. So our dip that we get at 5 feet is what?
2.3.
Last time you used 2.3.
Okay, we'll stick with that. It's a winning combination. Okay, so 3, 7 minus 2 is 5, 35.7, 31 degrees. And then our main correction is also negative based on the table. And what is that? 1.6? We hear going once, going twice? 1.6. Okay, so that's 1, and this is 34. So 31 degrees, 34.1 minutes is the HO. Okay? All right, so now we go to a different place in the almanac that we have not visited before. And it's like the modern day version of the rule of the North Star. It's called the Polaris tables. So I gotta remind myself where those are. They are in pages beginning 274. Question? Why saw Polaris for what? We haven't got there yet. So we're just going there just now. So you start with page 274. It's 274, 275, 276. Okay, and what you see going across is a bunch of numbers starting at 0 to the left, and they go all the way across, all the way through across the pages to 359 degrees at the right of the third page. And that is a row called LHA Aries. What does that mean? LHA Aries is derived from something called the sidereal hour angle. So what is that and why do we have it? Well, the reason we have it is because there's a lot of things in the sky we might want to use, like 57 stars. And this would be a really, really big book, okay, if you had the same thing for every one of those stars like you had for the sun. However, they picked this arbitrary point in the sky, kind of like we have the Greenwich Meridian, an arbitrary point in the Earth, and we call that's called the first point of Aries. And all the stars are giving a longitude relative to that, okay, each has their own sidereal hour angle. And it might change a little bit, but not by much. But it works out such that you can, again, you can economize on the amount of space you have to have this on. So sidereal hour angle. So where do we find that? Well, if we go back again to the August 21st page. Okay. And we see to the left of that, left page, which we've not been to before, we see the leftmost column is called Aries. And so we have a GHA of Aries now. Just like the GHA of the sun, it's the GHA of Aries. We're going to find the day and the hour and the minute and second. So and actually we're not on August 21st anymore. We're on August 22nd when we actually took the site in Greenwich Mean Time. We were at August 22nd at 3 hours and 4 minutes. So if we go to UT and we go to 22nd at 3 hours, it looks like we have a GHA of Aries of 15 degrees, 55.0 minutes. Okay, so this is GHA, and Aries symbols like that because Aries is the ram, and it's kind of like a ram with its horns. And it's, let me make sure I get this right, 15 degrees, 55.0 is the GHA of Aries. Now, just like before, we've got the minutes and seconds. Okay, so we've got 4 minutes to deal with. So, and we don't have to worry about a D factor or a declination or anything like that here when we're doing Polaris. So we go back to the page for just 4 minutes in the tinted pages. So we go to the 4-minute page and you see we have 3 columns, we have the sun and planets, that's one we've been using, followed by Aries, followed by the moon. So Aries, of course, is the one we're interested in. And we're 4 minutes along, and 4 minutes into the hour on Aries, it's 1 degree, 01.2 minutes. So 1 degree, 01.2 minutes. 4 minutes exactly, yeah.
So it'd be 0.2?
Be the top one.
Oh yeah, it would be the top one. You're right, I'm sorry. Yep, thank you. I got that. That only starts from here. 100.2. Okay. Cross that one out. 1 degrees, 00.2. Thank you. Okay, and this was this 15 degrees, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so this would be 16 degrees, 55.2 minutes, and that is the GHA of Aries.
56.2?
Yes, 56.2, sorry. 56.2. Why I haven't calculated. Okay, 16 degrees, 56.2. GHA of Aries. Okay, so now we can go to those Polaris tables. I'm gonna find it again. What did I do with them?
176. Or 174, 175, around there.
274.
I'm sorry, 276.
Oh, okay. I was just,
274,
that's not, that
275.
was my number.
Yeah.
Okay. 276, okay. Okay, so LHA of Aries, and we have an LHA of Aries at 16 degrees, 56.2 minutes. So, we cross over the table till we find the column that we're in, and it's between 50 and 59 degrees. See that? It's about the 6th column. It's on page 274, Polaris Star Tables, 2024. You start off with LHA Aries in that row, and you come over till you are bracketed to 50 to 59 degrees, because our LHA and GHA of Aries is, well, LHA of Aries, I just blew it. Once again, my apologies. LHA of Aries, let's add 360 to this. It's because they want the LHA of Aries, not the GHA of Aries. So we're going to get an LHA of something, we've got to subtract our assumed longitude. So let's start off with adding 360. So that ends up being 376 degrees, 56.2 minutes. We have an assumed longitude. I'm going to say now it was 116 degrees, 56.2. And that gives us an LHA of Aries of 260 degrees. Okay, my apologies. We got the GHA of Aries, 16 degrees. We're going to have to subtract our longitude from that. So whenever you're confronted with having to subtract from a number that's smaller, you just add 360 to it. So that gives us 376, 56.2, assumed longitude of 116, 56.2, and LHA of Aries of 260. So the column we're looking for is actually on that third page, page 276, and it's 260 to 269, because it's 260, because ours is 260. And so we cross over. Aries is 260 even, and if you look at the column, the first number you're looking for is called A sub 0. And that number is 1 degree, 30.2 minutes. Okay? So, A.
Why the A sub 0?
Why do they call it that?
Or why pick that one?
Well, again, it's just, so what you have to do is you have to correct for the fact that Polaris isn't really right at the North Pole. And so it's orbiting around it. So whenever we measure our sextant, there's some error there. And this is a correcting, it's like a main correction for Polaris.
Okay.
Okay? So, and what you do, there's a formula at the bottom that you start out with your HO, corrected for refraction and dip. You subtract 1 degree from it, and then you add A sub 0, A sub 1, and A sub 2. And so A sub 0 is this first part of the column, of the table. Then you've got the second and the third. Okay, so let's go ahead. So latitude equals HO minus 1 degree, okay, plus A0 plus A1 plus A2. So if we go ahead and work that out, HO is 31 degrees, 34.1 minutes. Subtract a degree, and we end up with 30 degrees, 34.1. Okay? Now I'm just going to come over here because there's blank space. So we have 30 degrees, 34.1 minutes, to which we add now A sub 0. And the A sub 0 number we pulled from this 260 to 269, if you come down to LH areas, you see 0 degrees, that's even. That's 260 even, and that gives you 1 degree, 30.2 minutes. That's A sub 0. So, 1 degree, what did I say, 30.2?
Yes.
Okay. 30.2. Okay, and then what's A sub 1? Well, A sub 1, we stay in the same column as A sub 0, and we drop down to the next section where it has our closest latitude. And our closest latitude is probably 30 degrees. And at 30 degrees, that gives us in the same column an A sub 1 of half a minute, 0.5 minutes. Okay? So we add 0.5 to that. And then staying in the same column, we drop down to the next section so that we find the month. And the month is August, and that gives us a correction of 0.9 for the month. So A sub 2 is 0.9. So we add all of these. So 1 and 2 is 3, and 5 is 8, and 9 is 17. 5, and these are zeros, that's 5, 30, 60. Wait a minute. 665. That can't be right. It's 65.7, right? Yeah. So 31 degrees. So 31 degrees, 65.7 minutes, or 32 degrees, 05.7 minutes equals our latitude. Okay? So let me review this again. We first predicted when it was going to be twilight, so when we could see we could see the stars and see the horizon. And then we decided we're going to try and get our latitude by Polaris. We want our latitude. So this was August 21st, and we predicted it was going to happen at 7:50 something. We actually took the sighting at 8:04. Okay, and we got it. Sort of all these converging things, that this sort of ongoing the ongoing development of national institutions of science, organized institutional science, the development of navigational techniques, of instruments. There was also this period where there were all sorts of people that were basically attempting to win fame and fortune by solving the technical problems of the day. So all these genius inventor types, they were actually converging on the problem as well, and attempting to impose on the world and on thought this sort of system of organized understandings of nature and the natural world. And that had extended all the way back to antiquity. And of course, what they're trying to overcome are all the dangers and horrible outcomes that occurred from failure to know how to navigate places. So Sir Claudius Lee Shovel, wreck of HMS Association last time, was in its day as famous as the Titanic is in ours, because it was this maritime catastrophe. And even though finding the longitude by astronomical means wouldn't have helped him, that was used or cited as a reason for establishing this huge award for whoever would solve the longitude problem. So that was well in hand and moving along by the middle to late 18th century. But then something else happened in the 18th century that is one of these events, or one of these voyages, that culminated all of these stories of voyage accounts that had been going back all the way back to Magellan and Vasco da Gama and before that. And so and this was this particular voyage by Commodore George Anson between 1740 and 1744. Now, there had been an avid appetite for voyage accounts. In fact, it was one of the first popular genres in literature about people, and it was the way that people that didn't go out on voyages came to an understanding about what the outside world was like. And so down below in that exhibit, you see all these voyage accounts. And some of those voyage accounts inspired then fiction writing, like Daniel Defoe writing Robinson Crusoe based on this actual guy, Alexander Selkirk, or George Shelbach in this picture here, which is also down below, which ultimately inspired a lot of stories, including The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And Shelbach didn't inspire Jonathan Swift, but some of the earlier ones did. So these voyage accounts often occurred because they were the adventures of people that were ranging the world for reasons of not just of trade or of exploration, but to get wealthy by taking other people's stuff, like Francis Drake, right? Which it was sometimes been referred to as the first klepto navigation of the world. So, but it was a big deal, because what you could do if you got the right ship, if you captured the right ship, you could be wealthy beyond your wildest dreams, because there were immense concentrations of wealth in some of these things. And so the one that everybody wanted to capture after about the 1570s or so was the fabled Manila Galleon. Now, there had been dramatic cases of capturing ships and making a lot of money. Francis Drake took the Cacafuega off the coast of Peru and made a lot of captured its entire cargo and got home with it. John Cavendish captured another wealthy Spanish galleon. He actually sailed up the Thames. He had sails made out of silk from the cargo he had ripped off, lined in ermine and with all sorts of gold, decorations all over his sails. Well, he liked attention, So in any case, there was, especially among the Dutch and the English, there was a sense that you could not only become famous, you could become immensely wealthy, but you could become a pop culture, hero of your day, a cult figure, if you will. One of the most famous of all was the Dutch East India Company director, Piet Hein, who captured an entire Spanish treasure fleet in the East in 1628, and he became immensely wealthy. And that capture alone funded the the emerging Dutch national government for a decade thereafter, and helped basically ignite the golden age of Dutch culture, Dutch seafaring in the 17th century. So, but the big prize of all were these Manila galleons. They began to be established in 1570s, excuse me. And to understand really what was driving this, the Spanish, when they got to the New World, they basically fell into the wherewithal to be able to trade with China. And trading with China had been a dream ever since Marco Polo. In fact, there had been ongoing trade between China and Europe going all the way back to the Silk Road to the time of Aristotle and before that. But that had been interrupted by the rise of the Ottoman Empire, which closed off most of those routes between China and Europe, and was provoking a lot of these voyages. The voyage of the Portuguese program by Vasco da Gama and Bartolomé Diaz, and then Columbus sailing west, were attempts to outflank that block of the trading route by the Ottomans, who had installed themselves as middlemen, taking much of the wealth. So
How were they doing that? Were they basically blocking the land traffic?
Yeah. The Silk Road ran right through the Ottoman Empire.
Okay.
So they grabbed it all, and basically nothing got through. For a long time, the Venetians were in alliance with the Ottomans, and the Venetians were distributing all of this stuff throughout the Mediterranean. There was this concept that there were two religions in conflict. They really weren't. It was two mercantile empires. In any case,
when did they stop the trade, the Ottomans?
The Ottoman Empire had been ascendant from the 1200s, 1300s. Yeah, and it reached its apogee in the 17th century, or the 16th century, excuse me. They captured Rhodes in about 1545. The greatest siege of the medieval world was Malta in 1565, and then the Battle of Lepanto, which pretty much stopped them, took place in 1571, funded by Spanish silver and gold that they got from the New World. So once Spain had got to the New World and discovered pretty quickly it was full of silver and gold, they had the wherewithal to be able to trade with China. They just had to be able to get there, and the New World, for all the silver and gold it had, was also in the way. There was no canal through Panama, and as Magellan found, going around the bottom of South America was a pretty onerous task. He lost almost his entire crew, and he died also. So the Spanish began to establish colonies on the west coast of the Americas, in Peru and in New Spain or Mexico, and from there to establish a trading network which crossed the Pacific. And so their main ports for doing this were Lima in Peru, Acapulco in Mexico, and then Veracruz in the Caribbean. So silver mined in Peru would be taken to Panama, sent across the Isthmus of Darien, and then up the coast to Veracruz, and then go back to Spain. Gold and silver mined in Mexico would be sailed down, would be sailed up on the coast to Acapulco, taken over the mountains to Veracruz, and then these two fleets, one from Panama, one from Veracruz, would join, sail through the Florida Straits and back to Spain. However, only about 2/3 of the wealth generated in the New World ended up going to Europe. The rest of it was used to trade with China. So what China wanted was that silver and gold, because all the world's economies were not running on credit, they were running on actual specie. It was really the Dutch that invented the modern credit system that we use today in the 17th century. So if you're running your whole economy on gold, it can only grow to a certain point based on the amount of money you have for exchange. And since ancient times all the way up to the 16th century, there wasn't all that much gold, if that's your major medium of exchange. It said that all the gold in the world could be put into a cube about 10 feet on the side, and that's all there was. That's all there ever was, because people's ability to mine it was just about replacing the gold that had been lost in shipwrecks and lost elsewhere. People buried it in hoards and things like that, grave hoards and grave goods. So that had limited the entire world's economic system until the Spanish sort of blundered into Mexico, and then within the space between in 1520, all the gold in the world could be put into a cube 10 feet on the side. By 1530, there were 4 of those cubes, and the Spanish had 3 of them. So you can understand the immense change that made in their prospects and in the world economy. And it gave them the wherewithal to trade with China, so that the Spanish had the gold the Chinese wanted, and what China had was jade and porcelain and silk and finished goods and craft goods and things like that. So the value of these things were so dense that you could get across the Pacific with just one ship. The other thing, of course, that was being highly sought after at the time were spices: pepper, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, that sort of thing. Those were found mostly in an area of the world called the Moluccas, and the reason for Magellan's voyage wasn't to sail around the world, it was to find the Moluccas and lay Spanish claim to them and determine which side of the line of demarcation the Moluccas were on. And so who owned the Moluccas? Was it the Portuguese or the Spanish? Remember, Pope Alexander VI drew that line down the Atlantic. Everything on one side was Spanish, everything on the other was Portuguese, but no one knew exactly where that line went on the other side and what line on one side or the other. So as it turns out, Spain did have a pretty good claim on those Moluccas, but they ended up trading the Moluccas with Portugal for the Philippines. Why would they do that? Well, by the time they made this trade, the wealth of China, all the silk and porcelain and ivory and finished goods and jade and things like that, was actually worth more than the spices were, and people were beginning to find those same spices in other places like Africa also. So the Portuguese got the Moluccas and Spain got the Philippines, established a colony there, and they would trade from the Philippines to China. So once a year, a ship would get underway from Acapulco, take about 80 days or so, 90 days, to cross from Acapulco to Guam at about latitude of 13.5 degrees north. They could do latitude sailing using Polaris, just like we learned how, and doing noon sights, getting all the way across the ocean to Guam, and then they would replenish with water and some food, and then sail through the San Bernardino Strait to Manila. And then on the way back, as is shown on this chart, they would sail far to the north off of Japan and cross in the westerlies. Now in this map you can see how the ships about sailing across in the northeast trades to Guam, they got all their sails set, they're running, everything looks calm and placid. Up to the north, they're not carrying quite so much sail. It's a bit rougher doing that. And indeed, the trip back eastbound was a lot harder than the trip there. It averaged about 200 days, okay? During the course of the Manila-Galleon trade between 1574 and 1815, about 15 galleons went missing without a trace. Others were captured, but some of them were just gone. One of them, a galleon called the San Jose, was found floating off of Peru about 2.5 years after it had last been heard of, with every single person on board dead from scurvy, or dead from, well, it was something else that had happened to them that was fairly gruesome that they didn't go into great detail on, but scurvy was the main thing. So it was a rough trip back. So on the way there, they would stay right across the latitude. Going eastbound, they would sail up off Japan, where there were typhoons, cross the Pacific, the North Pacific, and then angle down on the line of latitude about Cabo San Lucas, which is about 20 degrees north. They would make their landfall at Cabo San Lucas, and then they would come down and pick up Cabo Corrientes, where modern-day Puerto Vallarta is, and then sail into Acapulco. So this was usually one ship, generally, sometimes two, but mostly one. And the ship going across was called the Acapulco Galleon. The ship coming back was called the Manila Galleon. And sometimes they were the same ship, but there was always a ship waiting just in case the one from Acapulco never showed up. And people would go to the Philippines and make a fortune. Spanish and other Europeans would, and earn their wealth, and those would come back on the Manila Galleon. About a third of that stuff they got from China ended up staying in the New World, and the rest of it went back to Europe. It was the longest trading route on Earth, and it was the longest trading route continuously running on Earth, all the way between the 1570s to 1815. So if you want to capture one of these, understand that as much as a 16th of the world's entire wealth might have been on this one ship. Just visualize that for a second, what that would mean. And so the main defense, as well as the main danger for one of these galleons, was the vast Pacific into which they disappeared for months on end. And they would hide there in this vast expanse, and there was not really a good way to find them, except if you knew they were going to run down the latitude of 13.5 degrees north than just be a little bit to the east of Guam, and they come on right on home, right? Or off the weather of San Bernardino Strait, or coming the other way off Cabo San Lucas. Position yourself there, and they're just come homing right in on you like you had an AIS that they were coming in on. And that's what the English and the Dutch tended to do. And so that's how Pitt Hein captured an entire Spanish treasure fleet in the east. Well, they really wanted to, the Europeans really wanted one of these galleons, but they weren't so easily taken, actually. There were several problems with it. For one thing, they were built in the east usually, and the Manila galleons were very stoutly built, very thick planks, immensely thick framing, and almost solid framing, made out of hardwood. So you had to have a pretty big gun or guns on your ship to even penetrate the hull. So they were almost impervious to almost anything else that could have gotten there from Europe. And then getting there was another problem. There were the navigational issues. How do you get there? You go through the Strait of Magellan around Cape Horn. That wasn't easy to do. But you're also looking at a really long voyage. So at the time, this is what was on the menu if you were a naval vessel and you were headed out to sea. So you got biscuit, a pound of it a day, every day. You got a gallon of beer a day. So they were drinking quite a lot, and if they ran out of beer, they did have other spirits. Beef, 2 pounds twice a week. Pork, 1 pound twice a week. Dried peas, got that half of a quart of that, half a pint, 4 times a week. Oatmeal, 3 times a week. Butter, a little bit of butter or cheeses, 2 ounces of it twice a week, 3 times a week, and that's it. So what do you notice about this as far as its dietary sufficiency?
No vegetables.
No, there's not vegetables. There's a lot of food, or there could be a lot of food, so they were eating a lot of calories, but there wasn't a lot of vegetables. Vegetables didn't last very long. So what that means is there's a whole lot of dietary deficiencies that start to ensue, particularly among Europeans that might not have actually been eating that well to begin with before they got on the ship. So signs of dietary deficiency could begin to occur after only 6 weeks. And again, even a Manila galleon going westbound, the easy way to go, it might be 200 days. Or sorry, it might be 3 or 4 months getting across and coming back, it might be 200 days. So getting from Europe into the Pacific would have been difficult. So in addition to the problem of time and navigation, human bodies are also clocks. And the problem with that is with these dietary deficiencies, they were all called scurvy. Today, scurvy is just the deficiency of vitamin C. That's the worst one, but you could be getting lots of vitamin C and still die of scurvy in the 18th century if you weren't getting thiamine or B12 or B3 or a number of things. But vitamin C is the big issue. And the reason that's important is because most animals can synthesize vitamin C on their own, and vitamin C in almost all mammals is the material that holds your cells together. It's the interstitial material. It also is a component of scar tissue. It's your hair, your teeth, your fingernails. It's what gives your skin elasticity. It's what allows you to recover from disease. So collagen is extremely important, and your body can't make collagen without vitamin C. It's an essential ingredient. And humans, and there's a couple of primate species, can't do that without vitamin C. Now, interestingly enough, pregnant women can make vitamin C and generate collagen without any outside source of vitamin C of fresh vegetables. So can children up until about the age of puberty and a little bit beyond. But adult males, and that's mostly what you have on ships, they're just flat out of luck, right, that this happens. And they knew very early on that oranges and lemons and things like that would cure this problem, but they didn't last. And there were various things that people thought would cure scurvy. In the 18th century, Priestley and a couple of other scientists discovered acids and bases and noticed that orange juice and lemon juice and citrus was acidic. And so I thought, okay, it's an imbalance, like a humoral imbalance under the medical system that the Roman physician Galen had established. So the real problem is an improper balance of acids and bases. So if someone gets scurvy, the thing to give them is hydrochloric acid or sulfuric acid. Okay, that didn't work so well. They thought it might be ventilation. They thought it just might be people who were lazy. This was just a problem of people being lazy. So if they're showing fatigue and and looking like their teeth are falling out and their hair's falling out. And get them up working, get them up dancing, and of course that flushes vitamin C out of your system and makes it worse. The Dutch thought that they noticed that when people got back to land, if scurvy wasn't too bad, people recovered once they started eating fresh food from the shore. So I thought, well, the land is what cures it. So what the Dutch often did was, if someone got scurvy, they just buried sailors up to their necks in dirt, and they carried big boxes of dirt to try and do that. So there was always kind of this sort of trial and error method, which wasn't a very kind experience for the people enduring it. It wasn't until 1748 that someone finally did an experiment that determined for sure that whatever it is in citrus fruits, that is definitely the thing that is missing in the diet. It was a guy named James Lind on an English warship called HMS Salisbury in a cruise in the English Channel. He took 12 seamen and he gave them 6 different things. He gave them seawater, gave them bread, gave them hydrochloric acid, gave them a thing called Ward's Drop and Pill, and there was one other thing, they gave them some purgative that was really bad. Though they bled them, it gave them the purgative. And then oranges. And the 2 that had oranges, they did fine, they recovered. No one else did, and some of them died. So that was the first clinical experiment in all of history. All of modern clinical medicine comes from that one example of James Lind on HMS Salisbury. That wasn't available, though, in 1740, no one knew that. And this is what they were dealing with. Well, it really wasn't that big of a deal for naval practice, because the main paradigm for fighting war at sea were these fleets of ships, typically ships of a line, which was fight as fleets, and they would be massed with sufficient numbers to achieve a favorable outcome anywhere they went. But the places where you see this activity was taking place, at least for the English, it was the Mediterranean, the Baltic, the North Sea, the Mediterranean, and the east coast of North America. So all of those places you can get to pretty quickly, within a few weeks at most. So scurvy could be dealt with and managed. The problem happens if you're trying to project naval power a great distance. And you need to do that if you're going up against something like a Manila galleon, because if you send a kind of ship that's smallish, well, it's just not going to prevail against one of them. So at the beginning of 1740, England decided to declare war on Spain. They did it periodically because Spain often had more money than they did, and they figured it was a good way to get whatever more they wanted of what Spain had. So this particular one was called the War of Jenkins' Ear, and England declared war on Spain because the Spanish Coast Guard captain captured an English sea captain named Jenkins, and when he was smuggling, cut off his ear and gave it to him. He said, "Here, give this to your king and tell him if he were here, I would serve him in like manner." So Jenkins went back and gave it to somebody in Parliament. He waved the ear around in Parliament and said, "This is an outrage. I demand we declare war," and the British did, all based on some guy with his ear cut off. Presumably it was the same ear that Jenkins actually got cut off. But whatever the case, it was a handy ear to have, and it generated an attempt by the English to take over Spain's empire in the Pacific. So this was a scheme concocted by 2 members of the Admiralty Board, Sir John Wager and Sir John Norris, and they had this plan of sending 2 fleets to the Pacific. One would depart from Britain, sail around the Cape of Good Hope, through the Straits of Malacca, and to the Philippines and capture the Philippines. A second fleet would leave Britain, sail down the North and South Atlantic, around Cape Horn, up by Central America on the west coast, and notice California is an island here in this picture, and up and capture either the Acapulco or the Manila galleon, and then sail across the Pacific with all that wealth, join up with the British there, and start the British Empire in the Pacific. The key to it was capturing one of these galleons, because they had what the British wanted most. Again, it wasn't easy to do. Shellbach attempted to capture a Manila galleon and couldn't do it. And Woodes Rogers, in this picture, was attempting to capture a galleon called the Begonia with 2 smaller English ships, the kind of ships that could actually cover great distances because they had relatively small crews. The 2 ships, the Duke and Duchess, had 6-pounders, about the size of what the Californian has. They fought the Begonia for 6 hours. The Begonia suffered 500 hits and no casualties. Not a single one of those shot penetrated the top sides of the Begonia. And so the English just gave up. They'd sailed halfway around the world to get there and just said, well, not a good day. And they went on. And that was it. no Manila galleon for Woodes Rogers. In any case, they never gave up their dreams, this great scheme. And then when they decided to actually implement it, though, the British decided to also attack the Spanish in the Caribbean, and then resources started getting thin. So what they decided they would do is economize on it and just do the whole damn thing with one fleet. They would send an English fleet down the North Atlantic, down the South Atlantic, around Cape Horn. They would sail up the coast of South America, plundering along the way. They would capture the Acapulco galleon off of Acapulco, or the Manila galleon. They would cross the Pacific, because after all, that's not so hard, go across to the Philippines, wipe out the Spanish in the Philippines, take over the Philippines after having actually captured all of these harbors and ports on the coast of South America, and then sail home with all wherewithal. So it sounds like a good plan. So they decided, well, we could do all this. We could wipe out the Spanish in the Pacific with 6 ships. So these were the 6 they sent. The biggest was the Centurion of 60 guns, the Gloucester of 50 guns, and then 2 smaller ones called the Severn and Pearl, a couple of store ships, and that was it. And they were going to send about 2,000 men all told, with all the crews and Marines and everything else. The guy put in command of it was a guy named George Anson, who was a captain at the time. He was given the rank of Commodore. He was highly regarded. He had a lot of experience crossing the Atlantic anyway. In North Carolina, there's a county named Anson County after him because he was a popular guy there. And he also wasn't important enough to worry about if he didn't come back alive. So off they went. And they decided to arm him with he needed at least 2 regiments. So the first regiment they were going to send him, because money was getting tight, and they decided, well, your first regiment is going to they're going to be the pensioners of Chelsea Hospital. Now, Chelsea Hospital was an old folks home. It was for wounded veterans. And so everybody in Chelsea Hospital was either extremely elderly or they were amputees. Some of them were missing 1 limb, some limbs 2. A few of them had no limbs whatsoever. They had to be hoisted on board the ships, right? And so now Anson was outraged at that. He said, what am I supposed to do with these people? They're almost dead already and we haven't even set off. And they said, well, be happy with what you have. And he said, well, I need at least 1 more regiment of troops. I said, okay. So they emptied a London orphanage and gave them several hundred boys. Most of them, some of them 3, 4, 5 years old. The oldest were 10 or 11. And they piled them on the ships. None of them had ever held a firearm. The other Marines, the guys from Chelsea Hospital, couldn't hold a firearm or march or walk or anything. So the ones from Chelsea Hospital, the ones that had 2 legs, all of them deserted immediately. They didn't. Only the ones that couldn't even move on the ships. So off they went. Well, I mean, it sounds like it's interesting how it turned out, because a different end turned out for those children than one might have imagined. Anyway, the flagship was the HMS Centurion of 60 guns, and off they went. It took months to plan this, and the Spanish got wind of it, and they decided the Spanish would try and prevent the English from getting into the Pacific at all, and if they did, they would destroy Anson's fleet. And so they outfitted a larger fleet, bigger than Anson's, with 3,000 men, and they had, the admiral commanding it was a descendant of the conquistador of Peru, Pizarro, and he had 5 pretty big ships, plenty of men, and they would ambush Anson at the entrance of the Strait of Magellan or thereabouts. They reckoned all they really needed to do was confront him. The English ships would have had to clear for action. They would have had to throw a bunch of their supplies and stuff overboard in the process of clearing for action, and could have never gotten into the Pacific. So they found out when Anson left, and they began a cat and mouse game, chasing each other down the coast of South America, all the way down. At one point, one of the English ships got separated from the English fleet, saw a bunch of masts on the horizon, said, oh, there's our guys, went sailing over there and found they just sailed into the middle of the Spanish fleet and scrambled to get away, and barely got away. And that was the first time they really understood the Spanish were there. So they followed each other all the way down the coast to St. Catherine's Anchorage, and then St. Julian's Anchorage, which is where Anson went, which is where both Magellan and Drake had gone, and ended up executing, in each case, their second in command, but Anson didn't do that. They were all getting along much better at that point. And the weather wasn't bad, but even early on, in both fleets, sailors were starting to suffer from scurvy. And it just only got worse from there. As they didn't have much information about how to get through the Strait of Magellan, or into the Pacific, and both admirals decided to try and go around Cape Horn. This map that you see to the right is the Staten Island and Cape Horn, and a modern map shown below. To the right is what is in Shellbach's book, and that was the primary navigational account for getting around Cape Horn. We have a copy of that book, an original edition down below. Pizarro actually got into the Pacific a little ahead of Anson, by a few hours. And almost immediately he got into a horrific storm that sank one of the ships immediately and caused immense damage from the others. In fact, the storm more or less destroyed Pizarro's whole fleet. They separated, went different directions. Of the 3,000 men Pizarro started out with, about 150 made it home alive from that. So most of them died. So after this one really bad storm, which then hit Anson's fleet, the English fleet, a few hours later, there really wasn't much in the way of Spanish ships to contest their attempts to take over the Pacific. But what they did have to confront, however, was the worst weather on the face of the earth. If you look at the top right, that's called a pilot chart that shows the average wind and sea conditions for every month of the year. And what this will tell you is that there's almost no time off Cape Horn when the weather is not utterly horrendous. What happens is the wind blows very strong in the Southern Ocean. It blows all the way around the world because there aren't any big land masses to impede it. And then it gets compressed as to the seas between the Antarctic Peninsula and Cape Horn, building these big mountainous seas, which later came to be called graybeards. So that is what the English confronted as they attempted to get around. It's always horrendous, but the problem here is that these guys were dying along the way in increasing numbers every day. There are 14 or 15 primary source accounts of this voyage. The Hill Collection of Pacific Voyages has almost all of them. Harvard has some, and the rest of them are in Greenwich. So I've read all of them, plotted where all the ships were and all these accounts and so forth. And it's interesting, 2 or 3 of the officers regularly on this part of the trip wrote about wanting to commit suicide. They were freezing to death. The scurvy was hitting them hard. It has really bad, scurvy has really bad symptoms. Initially, you get really tired and fatigued. Your skin loses its elasticity. And when you get bruises, the bruises don't heal. When you eat, every time you eat, you make little wounds in your mouth. Those that never heal, and those get infected. So people's gums swelled up to many times their size, almost blocking their ability to eat more. Their teeth fell out, their hair fell out. And then what also happens, because collagen is the biggest constituent of scar tissue, every wound you ever had, every serious injury you ever had comes back, all right? So these guys lived pretty rough lives, so many of them probably did have injuries. And what was also worse, it was freezing cold, and there was just endless storms, one after the other. And some of the very first accounts of rogue waves come from this account, particularly Leo Heaps and Richard Walter, who was the chaplain on the Centurion. Both of them wrote about how on one occasion, a 60-gun ship of the line was picked up, thrown over on its side mass in the water, and remained capsized for 2 or 3 minutes, came back, and for the rest of her life, Centurion never got over a 10-degree heel to starboard that she had from that. Anyway, they were working their way down, trying to get to the west, and of course, they didn't know what their longitude was, and they also didn't know what the currents were doing. So they sailed all the way down nearly to Antarctica, back again. They thought they got far enough to the west. It turns out that the ships would always have one of them out ahead, and they were supposed to fire guns if they saw land. And one of the ships, the crew saw land, they fired their guns, and they almost got into, well, the land they saw was called Cape Noir, Black Cape, and they almost got into this really treacherous place called the Milky Way, which Slocum wrote about in his circumnavigation, and they immediately had to attack the ships as best they could and sail back down into the Southern Ocean again. This is after weeks and weeks of attempting to get around Cape Horn. They thought, like I said, that they'd gone to the west, and what this chart shows at the time where they thought they were, which is this big bend out to the west, and where they actually were much east. Also, the charts themselves were wrong in longitude as well, so that complicated the problem. They had agreed they would meet at an island named Socorro, which they didn't manage to meet there, and then at Juan Fernandez Island. Now, Juan Fernandez Island is the island that was made famous by Alexander Selkirk in the novel Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. And at the time of this, it was the most famous island in the whole Pacific Ocean. Nobody knew about Hawaii or anything, even though no one knew where it was. But they were going to rendezvous there because that had been a haven for pirates, and also there was no formal settlements, so the British could regroup there and they could recover from all of their illnesses. They didn't all make it. The store ship called the Wager sailed into this little trap here, this bay called the Bay of Piñas, ran onto a shelf ledge. The ship broke up. The crew, some of them made it ashore. They all got drunk as soon as the ship ran on the rocks, because that's what people did in those days. Sailors didn't know how to swim, and that was how they drank themselves to death sometimes. So, and then things just evolved into, all discipline was lost. The captain ended up having to have killed one of his midshipmen who was insulting him at the time, and then things just evolved into a really horrendous mess. A recent book about that, a really well-written book called The Wager, came out just a couple of years ago, and it talks about this particular issue. So the Wager was wrecked, and they never saw her again. But the Centurion, one of the little small vessels, the Trial, made it, as did the Gloucester, the 50-gun ship among them. The Severn and Pearl, the two 40-gun ships, ended up sailing back through around Cape Horn and back to England. They just decided they had had enough and weren't going to make it. So it was particularly interesting when the Centurion got to Juan Fernandez first, and then they saw the Gloucester on the horizon, and it looked, all the rig looked like a mess. It looked like the Surprise looks like down in the yard with all the yards of Cockville, and then it drifted away, and then it showed up a month later, and it looked really even more disheveled. So by this time, the men on the Centurion had recovered, and they sent a boat out to help the Gloucester get in. And the crew, they were horrified by what they found. First of all, the Gloucester had about close to 500 men when they left. There were only about 30 of them left by the time they got there. But the real issue was there weren't enough left, they weren't enough to sail the ship really, but they also couldn't man the pumps. Manning the pumps was backbreaking work. All wooden ships leaked. The Gloucester started to leak pretty badly. The water started to rise in the hold. The water got a lot above the level of all the barrels in the hold, so no more fresh water, no more food. Well, that's less of a problem if you can't eat because your teeth have all fallen out. But the real problem happened because when you get above the level of the food, it's not just that sailors can no longer get to it anymore, it's that the rats can no longer get to it. It turns out there were thousands of rats on the Centurion and now on the Gloucester, and now they started to starve to death. And the only meat they could get were the remaining remains and the remaining living people among the crew. So what had been found centuries earlier on the San Jose is the galleon that had all died of scurvy. What was horrific about it was a lot of those guys had been killed by rats. When they got to the Gloucester, there had been this ongoing battle between the few remaining guys that could walk or do anything and the thousands of rats that were besetting them. It was just a horror show of a thing. Anyway, they got the Gloucester into Juan Fernandez, and the crew that could recover started to recover. If you have scurvy so bad that all your wounds are coming back, basically your body's coming apart on the cellular level, and there's no recovery from that. So they continued to lose people at Juan Fernandez. By the time the situation stabilized, there were just barely enough people to man those two ships, but not man them with their full military cargo. Nevertheless, they attempted to make raids along the coast of South America. They attempted to find a Manila galleon, and they didn't. They were basically, the word went out that they were there, and they just, the galleon didn't leave Acapulco. And so Anson and his officers resolved that they would attempt to sail across the Pacific and attempt to waylay one on the other side of the Pacific. And off they went, the few remaining crew that were left. And the ships, again, got gradually more disheveled. The crew started to die, and finally there weren't enough men left to man both ships, so they set the Gloucester on fire, moved everybody on to the Centurion, and continued on. Ultimately, the Centurion came into the Chinese port of Macau, and that was a base for the British East India Company. the East India Company did not want to see a British man of war there at all because it was kind of their own kingdom. And Anson couldn't get supplies, he couldn't get an audience with the local ruler in Macau. And finally, he threatened to start sinking East India Company, British East India Company ships unless they were to intercede for him. So he got an interview with the governor of Macau, who asked him, well, what is it that you're doing? He explained that he was in command of a warship and they were sailing around the world attacking and sinking Spanish ships. And the guy said, no, what is it you're really doing? Because the idea of a ship sailing around the world sinking other ships seemed to be so preposterous and bizarre of a concept, they just did not want to believe that that's what he was doing. So he managed to explain to them what the British were doing. It made no sense to the Chinese, but he was able to barter for food and get food for his men. They actually got the Centurion into dry dock and fixed her up a bit. And at this point, they would have sailed home, except that Anson managed to convince his crew to make one more try to capture a Manila galleon, that they would waylay the galleon to the east of San Bernardino Strait. And that's where they went. They were now down to about a little more than 200 people on board the Centurion, and they set out to the east of San Bernardino Strait. And so finally, a British shipping line was going to confront, for the first time ever, a Manila galleon. And the galleon they were going to confront was the Nuestra Señora de Covadonga. They were two ships were about the same size. Centurion was better armed, but the problem was the Manila galleon had lots of guys on board, and the Centurion didn't. They had this tiny crew, enough to sail the ship, and they could not actually reload any of their guns. They'd be able to fire every gun one time. But they were anxious not to let the Spanish know how badly manned they were. The Spanish ship, the captain's name was Montoya, there was a thing that they did. They would take the spritsail yard and run it fore and aft along the bowsprit, which means I'm going to ram you and board you, and if that happens, there's going to be no survivors. So either surrender now or we're not taking any survivors. That's what the simple meant at the time. Anson, with his crew, tiny by comparison, swung his spritsail yard fore and aft like, I'm going to board you and there'll be no survivors for you either. Well, the thing about it is that by this point, almost all the adult men other than the officers had died. Anson's crew was mostly the remnants of that regiment of children from the orphanage, right? So he had all the men up aloft with muskets, because that made a brave show that you think you have lots of crew, you can have guys with muskets up there, and then had enough kids to run down firing the guns. Well, Centurion was armed with 24-pounders, which was much bigger than what it was supposed to be, but that was deemed sufficient to blast through the side of the galleon. So when the Centurion came alongside the Covadonga, she let go with a rolling broadside, and it was so devastating to the crew of the Covadonga, which was thickly manned, they all just ran down to the hold, and they captured her. When Anson sent a boat over to bring the Spanish Captain Montoya back, he came aboard the Centurion and looked around and he goes, where's all your men? And he goes, this is it. He goes, I'm just seeing children. And he said, that's the crew. And he goes, I've just surrendered my ship to a boatload of children. And he demanded to be rowed back to start fighting the battle again. But Anson wouldn't do that. So in any case, they captured the Covadonga, took her back to Macau, sold her there, and loaded all the silver and gold that was on the Covadonga onto the Centurion, sailed her home, and even though by this time the Spanish and now the French were looking for him the whole way. The last exciting moment when they were in the Bay of Biscay in a fog, and the Centurion found herself in the middle of a French fleet and managed to work her way out of it without getting seen. Finally got back to England, and it took a wagon train about 1.5 miles long filled with silver and gold to go from where they docked at the Pool of London all the way to the Tower of London. And it was an immense amount of wealth, and it was the equivalent of the national budget for England for 2 or 3 years. It was the largest haul that had ever been taken from the capture of any single ship. The crew of the Centurion normal people, sailors, didn't have bank accounts or checking accounts or credit cards or things like that. So when it came time to pay them their prize money, they were paid in cash. That wasn't really a very good thing to have happen, because they all showed up, they were paid in cash. These are mostly children, mind you, and by the end of that day, most of them were killed. They were hunted down on the streets of London and killed. And so the story of Peter Pan and the Lost Boys comes from all these kids on the Centurion, that made it home but never actually got to grow up because of of what happened. Anson himself went on to become extremely wealthy, a famous admiral. He fought other battles like the famous Battle of Cape Finisterre, but he was very, very keen on solving the problem of scurvy. And Anson actually started the whole regimen of ships that were on station of underway replenishment. There's an underway replenishment ship right across, right ahead of the carriers there. The United States and the British Navies are really the only ones that do that really well. But at this time, underway replenishment with fresh food was an important, it was an important strategic measure to make sure that crews were kept up. So that finally, when the climactic battle of the 7 Years' War took place between Admiral Hawke had just taken over the British fleet from Admiral Anson, and his French counterpart at the Battle of Quiberon Bay, the French assumed everybody in the British fleet would have been sick because they'd been at sea so long. They would have mostly all had to have been down with scurvy. So when the French fleet came out to fight them, that wasn't the case, and the French fleet were annihilated. Pretty much, they ran into Quiberon Bay in a storm, and most of those ships were destroyed in the bay. A whole battle fought in the middle of a gale. And it was one of the most decisive naval battles fought in the Age of Sail, but it wouldn't have turned out that way had there not been an understanding of dietary requirements and some measure to deal with it, which Anson himself had implemented. So from his writings, he often talks about hitting something upon the line. And what they referred to was after they got around the Horn and they could finally sail up the coast, they had to make Juan Fernandez Island. And so they got sailing the latitude, they got to the latitude of Juan Fernandez, and they didn't know, is it to the east of us or to the west of us, because they didn't know their longitude. Well, they sailed to the west for several days, and Anson and another officer thought they saw the sort of cloud formations over land that you would typically see, and suggested that they sail another day or two. Most of the other officers overruled and said, no, we're way too far to the west, it can't be there. They turned around and sailed east towards the coast of South America, expecting to find the island, and didn't. They raised the Cordillera, the Andes, and then had to sail back again. They lost about 100 men while they were doing that to scurvy because they didn't know their longitude. They finally for making the land. And so often Anson would use the phrase, we tried to hit it on the line. We tried to hit it on the line. It's evidently something that kept coming back to him. And he would say it in nightmares, and it's another story that lent itself to the story of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and set the stage again for basically for the Enlightenment, for an attempt to try and solve these horrendous problems and put limits on everything, put limits on how far people could sail, on the kinds of institutions the governments could afford, an attempt to bring order and regularity to things like exploration and trade and naval power. And again, set the stage for what would happen only a generation later as all these things converge together. All right, that's it for me for tonight. Thank you.